Namaste and good morning. Welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanasha Karanam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tavakotamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Karma Shapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Janaah. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Vivekananda and ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning, we will continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where we left off last time, and that is November 26th, 1883. We're in the midst of that day, and on page 313, near the bottom. And this was the day when they were celebrating the special annual celebration of the Sindhuriyapatti Brahmo Samaj, that was being held at Mani Malik's house in Calcutta. So Sri Ramakrishna had come, many Brahmo devotees had come. And again, this must have been the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. This was after the split between Keshav's Navabidhan and the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, or the General Brahmo Samaj. And so this must have been the General Brahmo Samaj where the celebration was taking place because of the people who were present, who were leaders of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. So, excuse me, continuing where we left off, Vijay, that is Vijay Krishna Goswami, a very prominent devotee of Sri Ramakrishna at this time, and a leader of the Brahmo Samaj, Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. Vijay had just returned from Gaya, where he had spent a long time in solitude and holy company. He had put on the ochre robe of a monk and was in an exalted state of mind, always indrawn. He was sitting before the master with his head bent down, as if absorbed in some deep thought. So Vijay, it should be said, as I mentioned in the beginning, he was a prominent devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna later said that Vijay was not a member of his inner circle, but Sri Ramakrishna had great love for him, and he was a sincere devotee, which is why, of course, Sri Ramakrishna had great love for him. He wasn't a hypocrite. He wasn't pretending like Hajra and some others, Mahimacharan Chakravarti. But Vijay was a sincere spiritual aspirant. And of those that I've seen, the ones that are mentioned in the gospel that are leaders of the Brahmo Samaj and also devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, he and Keshav Chandra Sen, the two of them were the most loved by Sri Ramakrishna of all of the devotees, the ones that came closest to Sri Ramakrishna. But even of the two, Vijay Krishna Goswami and Keshav Chandra Sen, Vijay was the one who was filled more with renunciation and spiritual ardor even than Keshav Chandra Sen. Sri Ramakrishna had tremendous love for Keshav, but he also recognized Keshav's weaknesses. But Bijoy was a true devotee Keshav was a true devotee also, but Bijoy was ready to go further. He was ready, he was filled with the spirit of vairagya, dispassion, renunciation. And so, as it says here, he had been spending months in solitude and spiritual practice, something that Keshav, he would spend time in spiritual practice, but he didn't separate himself from family and his duties at the Brahmo Samaj for long. But Bijoy had gone into solitude for months to practice intense spiritual disciplines, and he had put on the ochre robe of a monk. For those not familiar with the tradition, usually one puts on the ochre cloth if one has taken the final vows of a sannyasi. It's the sign of a sannyasi. But even according to scriptures and tradition, a Brahmin in particular is allowed to put on the ochre cloth at will if they're leading a intense religious life, even if they have not taken the vows of sannyasa. So there was nothing untraditional or non-orthodox about his having put on the ochre robe. So he had just returned from Gaya, and though it's not mentioned here, nothing is said about Gaya here. Gaya was and is still a very holy place, very sacred to the Hindu world. There's a image of Gadadhara Vishnu holding the mace, the military mace, the big war club, in one of his four hands. And so he's known as Gadadhara, the holder of the mace. And that is the temple where people go to offer oblations for their ancestors at Shraddha. And so, of course, everyone can't go there every year for the Shraddha ceremony, but if once in their lifetime a devout Hindu can go and make offerings for their ancestors, it's considered a great thing. So Ramakrishna's father had gone there before the birth and before the conception of Sri Ramakrishna. He had gone there and offered pindas, a special ball made with rice and sesame seeds. Offered these pindas to his ancestors, and then he had the vision afterwards when he was asleep. He had the vision of Vishnu saying that he wanted to be born as his son. So Gaya is a special place to the devotees of Sri Ramakrishna because that is thought to be the place of his origin, spiritual origin. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna never went to Gaya. He went on pilgrimage to various places and even places that are not far from Gaya. But he didn't go to Gaya, as he also did not go to Puri in Orissa. Those two places Sri Ramakrishna didn't go and would not go because he knew that if he went to either place, he would enter into ecstasy and never return. He wouldn't return to the body. And so he would not be able to fulfill the very purpose of his birth. And so these two places he avoided going to, though he had great regard for both. So Vijay had just returned from there. So casting his benign glance on Bijoy, the master said, "Bijoy, have you found your room?" And then he tells a story to explain what he means. So he just asks Bijoy, have you found your room? Let me tell you a parable. Once two holy men, in the course of their wanderings, entered a city. One of them, with wondering eyes and mouth agape, was looking at the marketplace, the stalls, and the buildings when he met his companion. The latter said, you seem to be filled with wonder at the city. Where is your baggage? And the first one replied, first of all, I found a room. I put my things in it, locked the door, and felt totally relieved. Now I am going about the city enjoying all the fun. So then Sri Ramakrishna continues, so I am asking you, Bijoy, if you have found your room. To M and the others, you see, the spring in Bijoy's heart has been covered all these days. Now it is open. So what does all of this mean? Sri Ramakrishna used to tell this story at various times, a story about the man going to the city and the two companions going to the city, and one of them went straight to the room which they had reserved for their lodging and secured his things there, and then he was free. Then he could go to the temple, he could go to see the marketplace, he could see the wonders of the city, etc., with a free mind. And so Sri Ramakrishna would say, first find your room, secure your things, and then your mind will be free. Meaning, first find your path, surrender your worldly responsibilities, at least to the sense of responsibility, by offering it to God, and then your mind will be free to practice spiritual discipline. But if you haven't secured your room yet, then your mind is not free. You're worried about where shall I set my bag while I'm looking around, and is someone going to take it or whatever. So first to secure your room, then the mind will be free. So that means one thing for householders, another thing for a monk. For a householder, it means that first you have to have some basic security. Not great wealth, not a huge house and expensive car and all of that. If you have it, good. If you don't have it, that's just as good. But first have some basic security so you're not worrying every day, how am I going to pay my bills? What is my family going to eat? Are we going to be thrown out on the street? No, work to have some basic security so that your mind is free, and then you can practice spiritual discipline. Again, don't think in terms of having the best of everything that you can have or you cannot have. That makes no difference with the spiritual life. But have basic security. If you don't have that, the mind won't be free. And that we can all see, the sound psychology of that. And then for a monk or a householder, it means finding your internal room and having things internally set in order so that the mind is free. And that's what he meant for Bijoy, because Bijoy was leading a life of renunciation now, though he had not taken monastic vows, but he was leading that kind of life, surrendering his duties and thinking about God. And so Sri Ramakrishna said that first about asking him a rhetorical question, have you found your room? Because he knew that Bijoy had. And then he says that to others that the spring in Bijoy's heart has been covered all of this time. Now it's open. So the spring of spiritual aspiration, the spring of higher consciousness, the spring of joy, all of that which comes when the mind and heart are pure and free from worry and concern. And so there's all of this implied in these statements, in this parable of Sri Ramakrishna about finding your room. There was a sadhu, he was actually a sadhu of our order whom I met in my first trip to India. He had passed away by my second trip to India. I mentioned him to another Swami, and the Swami said, that Swami has been wandering all of his life. My teacher, the Swami told me, my teacher would ask him, have you found your asana yet? meaning have you found the place where you're going to sit for meditation? Because he had spent so much time wandering around looking for places to meditate, when any place will do to the person whose heart is fixed on meditation. So it's the same sort of idea. Have you found your asana yet? Have you found your meditation seat yet? Find your meditation seat and then meditate, but don't spend your life looking for a place to meditate. In the same way, not for many years for some reason, but many years ago, I would meet people who would tell me that they were looking for a guru. Of course, I still find people who are looking for a guru, but the rest of the story is not as common in my experience now. People who would say that I can't practice anything, I can't practice spiritual discipline until I have a guru. So I'm looking for a guru, and they travel all over the country. They might go to India. They might travel around looking for a guru, with the idea that until I find a guru to my liking, then I can't do anything. Well, no. First, become a good disciple. If we don't have the attitude of a disciple, we won't even recognize a guru if we find one. And so don't put emphasis on finding the perfect teacher before I do anything. No, first prepare yourself, make yourself a true disciple. Begin your spiritual practice as you can, getting advice from what's available to you. And then when the guru comes, as the guru will come, then you'll be ready for the instruction that you get. So again, that's all of that is contained within this. So then he turns again to Bijoy and says, well, Shivanath is always in trouble and turmoil. He has to write for magazines and perform many other duties. Worldly duties bring much worry and anxiety along with them. So earlier in this conversation, which we read last week, Sri Ramakrishna mentions Shivanath again. So Shivanath, as I explained last week in this class, Shivanath was another leader of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, and one whom Sri Ramakrishna liked very much. In fact, at the beginning of this day, which we read last week, Sri Ramakrishna asked about Shivanath and said that he loved to see Shivanath. He felt happy when he would see Shivanath, showing that he felt a special love for him, which, as I said last time, was not quite reciprocated by Shivanath. Shivanath was critical of Sri Ramakrishna, but Sri Ramakrishna loved him because he saw within him good qualities. But he also saw the limitations of Shivanath. And so Sri Ramakrishna mentions those limitations not just for idle gossip or not to bring him down in the eyes of others, as we normally do, because we want to raise ourselves by bringing somebody else down. But Sri Ramakrishna would bring up things like this in order to instruct others, in order to show us what we should aspire after and what we should avoid. And so he says about Shivanath here that he's always in trouble and turmoil. That Shivanath, because he was a leader of the Brahmo Samaj, he was always worried about his duties and always running here and there, trying to keep the Samaj going and trying to promote it and trying to increase its membership, and worried about finances, no doubt, as leaders of religious organizations always are. And so he has to write for magazines and perform many other duties. And so worldly duties bring much worry and anxiety along with them. And so Shivanath was always immersed in all of these thoughts. So then Sri Ramakrishna continues, it is narrated in the Bhagavata that the Avadhuta had 24 gurus, one of whom was a kite. A kite is a particular big, large bird that found in India and other places. In a certain place, the fishermen were catching fish. A kite swooped down and snatched a fish. At the sight of the fish, about 1,000 crows chased the kite and made a great noise with their cawing. We see that sometimes with a hawk that has some prey, and crows began to chase after the hawk. Whichever way the kite flew with the fish, the crows followed it. The kite flew to the south, and the crows followed it there. The kite flew to the north, and still the crows followed it there. The kite went east and west, but with the same result. As the kite began to fly about in confusion, lo, the fish dropped from its mouth. The crows at once let the kite alone and flew after the fish. Thus relieved of its worries, the kite sat on the branch of a tree and thought, "That wretched fish was at the root of all my troubles. I have now got rid of it and therefore am at peace." So this is also a story Sri Ramakrishna would frequently tell, and a beautiful parable, as all of his parables, a very apt parable for our situation in the world. We find that we're in so much trouble. We're chased after this, chased after that person, chased after bill collectors, chased after so many things in life. Our boss, our relatives, our friends, society, the government, everybody chasing after us. And it's all because we're holding on to the fish of the world. So the kite in the story, this large bird, which caught the fish, it thought the crows were after it. And so it tried in every way to evade the crows, and the crows kept attacking it. And finally, by accident, in its maneuvers, it dropped to the fish, and immediately the crows went after the fish, because that's what they wanted. People are after the world. They're not after us, though it may seem that they're after us. And so when we let go of the world, then we find that the world leaves us in peace. Not complete peace, no, but in relative peace, because as long as there is a body, there are troubles, even for the holy men and women. As long as there's, even Sri Ramakrishna said about even the incarnation of God, that Brahman caught in the web of the five elements, meaning God incarnated in flesh, weeps. But relatively speaking, our troubles are caused by the fact that we're holding on to the fish of the world. And to the extent that we can let go of the fish of the world, we're free. And so he's saying that in relationship to Shivanath, only to illustrate the point, that the point is for all of us, that as long as we hold on to the fish of the world, we find that there is no peace. So he mentions this is a story from the Srimad Bhagavatam, one of the great scriptures of India, and one that Sri Ramakrishna was very fond of. He used to say that the Bhagavatam is fried in the butter of knowledge and soaked in the sugar syrup of devotion. And so it's a beautiful combination of the highest Advaitic knowledge and the highest devotion. So in the story, among the stories in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which basically is devoted especially to Sri Krishna, Vishnu and Sri Krishna, it's a Vaishnava text, but not in a narrow sense. Like the Gita and many other great scriptures of India, it's not a narrow-minded scripture. But it is centered in, or it is a central text for the Vaishnava tradition, and tells the story from a Vaishnava from the standpoint of Vishnu and Krishna, the story of the world. So there, among the stories, there's the story of the Avadhuta. Avadhuta means a realized soul. Literally, it means one who is washed clean. So one who is Dhuta and Avadhuta, completely washed free of the world, one who is an illumined soul. So an Avadhuta is a name for one like a Paramahamsa. It means basically the same thing, but whereas Paramahamsa refers to the ability to take the real and leave the unreal. Avadhuta refers to the fact that one has been washed clean of all illusion, that one remains in a state of the highest knowledge. So the Avadhuta tells about his 24 gurus, and one of them was this kite, this bird that he saw with the fish. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, the Avadhuta learned this lesson from the kite, that as long as a man has the fish, that is, worldly desires, he must perform actions and consequently suffer from worry, anxiety, and restlessness. No sooner does he renounce these desires than his activities fall away, and he enjoys peace of the soul. So then from this, what Sri Ramakrishna has said so far, we might assume that a spiritual aspirant should be free from all activity and not engage in activities. And that indeed is one way, and that was the traditional way of the sadhu, the monks and nuns, that they would give up all worldly relations and give up all responsibilities and give up engagement in all work except just the maintenance of the body. They would wander from holy place to holy place begging their food. They wouldn't cook because that would be work. They would beg their food, or they would go to a guest house where food is provided to pilgrims and to monks, and beg their food. And ideally, they would spend their time in meditation. But that doesn't happen, as Sri Ramakrishna will say later on. It doesn't happen with many, as he will say later on. So Sri Ramakrishna now amplifies the picture that it's not just giving up work and activity. He says, but work without any selfish motive is good. It does not create any worry, but it is very difficult to be totally unselfish. We may think that our work is unselfish, but selfishness comes unknown to us from no one knows where. But if a man has already undergone great spiritual discipline, then as a result of it, he may be able to work without any selfish motive. After the vision of God, a man can easily do unselfish work. In most cases, action drops away after the attainment of God. Only a few, like Narada, work to bring light to mankind. So here he says that work without any selfish motive is good. And so what Sri Ramakrishna has said is not contrary to Swami Vivekananda's teaching on karma yoga. Swamiji's teaching on karma yoga is that we know, as Sri Krishna teaches in the Gita, that no one can remain without activity even for a moment. Everyone is constantly engaged. Even if you decide that I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to sit here, you'll find your mind spinning on with all kinds of ideas, and you'll find yourself picking up things to do and so forth, because no one can sit without doing something even for a moment. Even if you're meditating, you're doing something. In fact, that's a very intense activity to try to meditate. To control the mind is a very intense activity. Swami Yatishwarananda used to say that if an ordinary person could look into the mind of an advanced spiritual aspirant, they would turn away in terror because of the intensity of the mind of an advanced spiritual aspirant. And so meditation is intense activity. But even among spiritual aspirants, even among those who have renounced the world, it's rare to find someone who can spend most of their time in meditation. Many of us think we can, but then when we have the chance to do it, we find we can't. And so my own guru, Swami Vireshwarananda, said that after his sannyasa back in the 1920s, he went to, or maybe it was even in the teens, he was a disciple of Holy Mother. He went to Rishikesh, which at that time was a place where only monks lived and a few shopkeepers, but it was a place in the foothills of the mountains where you first enter into the mountains, the Himalayas, and where monks and sadhus of various types lived and practiced spiritual discipline in the forest. So he was staying in a kutir, that is a hut, as monks would do there and still do there. Though now it's a large town, a very busy, bustling, and highly populated town. But in that day, it wasn't. And so he said in a cottage near his, there was a monk who would spend hours every day polishing his kamandalu, his water pot, his brass water pot. Why? Because he couldn't spend all of his time meditating, so he had to do something. But monks are not allowed, we're not traditionally allowed to do anything other than just meditate, study the scriptures, or something that was just whiling away the time, like polishing his water pot. And so I myself saw that when I went to Gangotri some years ago and spent a couple of weeks there. how many of the sadhus living in caves and so forth and in kutirs could not spend their time fruitfully, and so they just whiled away their time. That's why Swami Vivekananda had said it would be much better if the monks of this country, when he was in India, the monks of this country would engage in some useful work for the welfare of society, not contrary to the renunciation of a monk, but doing work for the welfare of others, not for himself, but for the welfare of others, that wouldn't hurt. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna says here, that work without any selfish motive is good. It doesn't create worry. But then he says it's difficult to do work without selfish motive. One has to do intense spiritual practice in order to get there where one can work without a selfish motive, without thinking, I'm doing this for my sake. This is my work. I'm doing it for me because I'm going to get something out of it. So, as he says, selfishness comes unknown to us from no one knows where. Yes, even when we try to engage in selfless service of others, we find that somehow or another some selfish motivation comes into it. So, without intense spiritual discipline, it's not possible to sustain it. So, when we begin, whether as a householder or as a monk, when we begin on this path, we have to accept that selfishness comes into everything that we do. So be aware. We have to be aware of that, and then try to watch what's happening, and at the same time practice spiritual discipline. So Swami Brahmananda, the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, Brahmananda used to say that begin with work and worship. That is, do the work that you have to do, because again, everyone has to work. And even in the Ramakrishna mission, everyone joining has to work. So do your work, and also at the same time practice spiritual discipline. So the two go together. And then gradually you come to a point where you begin to do the work as worship. So work and worship, that leads to work as worship, where the work itself, you begin to make that part of your spiritual practice. That becomes a spiritual discipline. And then finally, work is worship, where finally the work, there's no distinction between work and spiritual practice. That becomes direct spiritual practice. It becomes worship itself. It becomes worship of the divine in everything. So again, that's not inconsistent with Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. In the early years of Swami Vivekananda's mission, after he had begun teaching in America, some of his brother disciples, householder and monastic, thought that he had gone astray. He was leaving Sri Ramakrishna's teachings because he was teaching this path of activity, of karma yoga, where Sri Ramakrishna emphasized reducing your entanglement in the world, reducing your responsibilities, spending your time thinking about God, and so forth. But here in many places, if we read Sri Ramakrishna's teachings carefully, we find that there's not a divergence between Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna. Difference in emphasis, yes, and that also can easily be explained when we study the two. But not a difference, difference, and certainly not a contradiction. So he says, in most cases, action drops away after the attainment of God. And that's true for most people, whether we have followed the path of karma yoga or not. When one has attained to the vision of God, then most people, whatever their life has been like, their work falls away naturally. Because once you have attained to the vision of God and you know that God is the doer, then the very idea that I am going to do something, that doesn't arise. Swami Ashokananda, who is one of the great Swamis of our order, a highly illumined, highly spiritual, a very powerful teacher, he said from the pulpit, I heard a recording of a tape of one of his lectures. He said once that someday, hopefully, when it's time to come for the lecture, I won't come, because the very idea of me giving a lecture and going and standing on a podium and teaching people, that very idea won't arise. And so when one has the full vision of reality, that is, when one has attained to the highest illumination, then the very idea of doing work, the very idea of agency, that I have this to do, even as a practice, as a practice, it's fallen away. And Sri Ramakrishna says that only a few, like Narada, work to bring light to mankind. That is, there are only a few who attain to the highest illumination, and then, whether it's because of a strong past intentionality of helping others, or it's more likely the will of the Divine Mother, that she has them carry on work after illumination. It's not something that's up to our choice. That I get illumination and then I'm given a choice. Okay, you could work or you could not work. No, for most of us, at that time, when the full blaze of illumination comes, work will fall away from us. So he continues. The Avadhuta accepted a bee as another teacher. Bees accumulate their honey by days of hard labor, but they cannot enjoy their honey, for a man soon breaks the comb and takes it away. The Avadhuta learnt this lesson from the bees, that one should not lay things up. Sadhus should depend 100% on God. They must not gather for the morrow. But this does not apply to the householder. He must bring up his family. Therefore, it is necessary for him to provide. Birds and monks do not hoard. Yet birds also hoard after their chicks are hatched. They collect food in their beaks for their young ones. And so that, of course, is similar to the teachings of Jesus in the Christian scripture, where Jesus says, the foxes have their holes and the birds have their nest, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. But he also says, is similar to what Sri Ramakrishna says about birds here, that they don't gather except to feed their young. He says that take no thought for the morrow, that the birds take no thought for the morrow, but who has clothed them more beautifully than the birds are clothed? I forget the actual quotation, but that's the sense of it. And so the idea that the monk should not save for the next day. The monk should not gather up and keep for the future, but that householders have to, because society depends on the householder. The society depends on the householder to provide for the family. The family is the basic unit of society, the most basic social unit. And unless parents provide for their children, unless spouses provide for each other, then the very maintenance of life cannot go on. And as Swami Vivekananda said, and as Sri Ramakrishna recognized, though he doesn't say it here, the very existence of the institution of monasticism depends on the householder. If it were not for the householders providing for monastics, then monastics themselves would not be able to exist. And so the householder has a great responsibility of providing for the family, providing for the welfare of society, and providing for the welfare of religious institutions. Without that, there is no society. Without that, civilization disappears. So Swami Vivekananda always emphasized that in a society, if monasticism becomes overemphasized, as it was in Buddhistic times in India, so that any good person and religious person feels that the path of religion means renunciation of the world, so I have to renounce the world, then society is only left to the weak. And so he said that there has to be a balance between the institution of monasticism and the strength of the householders. If the strength of the householder ideal becomes weak in society, then monasticism itself cannot be strong. So, so anyway, back to the main point here is that the householder collects for the is supposed to collect for provision for the family, for society, and for religious institutions, and the monk is expected not to collect for himself, herself. Let me tell you one thing, Bijoy. Don't trust a sadhu if he keeps bag and baggage with him and a bundle of clothes with many knots. I have seen such sadhus under the banyan tree in the Panchavati. 2 or 3 of them were seated there. One was picking over lentils, some were sewing their clothes, and all were gossiping about a feast they had enjoyed in a rich man's house. They said among themselves, "That rich man spent 100,000 rupees on the feast and fed the sadhus sumptuously with cake, sweets, and many delicious things." All laugh. So, so Sri Ramakrishna says not to trust a sadhu who doesn't exemplify the ideal of renunciation. And then he gives the examples. And then Bijoy says, "It is true, sir. I have seen such sadhus at Gaya, where he had just been staying. They're called the Lotawala sadhus of Gaya. Lotawala means the sadhus with the kamandalu. And of course, I'm not sure why that came to be used because most sadhus, even those of great renunciation like Totapuri, they may have nothing else, but they always have a kamandalu. But anyway, that's the term he says was used for the monks of Gaya who would spend their time in idle gossip. Master to Bijoy. When love of God is awakened, work drops away of itself. If God makes some men work, let them work. It is now time for you to give up everything, you Bijoy. Renounce all and say, O mind, may you and I alone behold the mother, letting no one else intrude. So here he says that if God makes some men work, let them work. It's now time for you to give up everything. So he's saying that to Bijoy because Bijoy was a leader of the Brahmo Samaj. So he's encouraging him to give up his duties at the Brahmo Samaj. That's not for you now. If God makes others work, let them work. That's not your business. You don't have to think that, well, everybody else is so busy, I have to be busy too. No, the time has come for you to turn your mind to other things. So, O mind, may you and I alone behold the mother, letting no one else intrude. He quotes the song. Saying this, Sri Ramakrishna began to sing in his soul-enthralling voice. Cherish my precious mother Shyama, that is Kali, tenderly within, O mind. May you and I alone behold her, letting no one else intrude. O mind, in solitude enjoy her, keeping passion all outside. Take but the tongue, that now and again it may cry out, O mother, mother. So that is, as you go inside, then take only your tongue with you. Leave the other senses behind, but take the tongue with you so that it cries out, O mother, mother. Suffer no breath of base desire to enter and approach us there. So again, referring in a beautiful way to the refinement of breath, which happens naturally in meditation. When we go within, then the breath becomes finer and finer until it practically disappears. And of course, in samadhi, in deepest samadhi, it may actually disappear. But suffer no breath of base desire to enter and approach us there. As the mind gets focused, then the breath itself again seems to depart. But bid true knowledge stand on guard, alert and watchful evermore. So the sword of discrimination, keeping the sword of discrimination, that is keeping true knowledge, knowledge of what is true and what is untrue, knowledge of the infinite, keeping that and standing guard. The Master said to Bijoy, surrender yourself completely to God and set aside all such things as fear and shame. Give up such feelings as, what will people think of me if I dance in the ecstasy of God's holy name? The saying, one cannot have the vision of God as long as one has these three, shame, hatred, and fear, is very true. Shame, hatred, fear, caste, pride, secretiveness, and the like are so many bonds. Man is free when he is liberated from all these. So here, first of all, he says, surrender yourself completely to God and set aside such things as fear and shame. And then he mentions something that he would often say. It's from the Vaishnava tradition, but it's consistent with all of Vedanta. But the saying is from the Vaishnava tradition, Lajja Grina Bhoy, Teen Thakte Noy. If there is Lajja, Grina, Bhoy, which I'll come back to, if you have those three, then Noy means it doesn't happen, meaning that then the love for God doesn't, pure love for God doesn't arise. So Lajja, here it's translated as shame, but here, lajja is a bigger term than the shame. Shame in English has very negative connotations as I'm ashamed of myself. I feel ashamed that I did something wrong. So that's not what it's talking about. Here, lajja means timidity. Lajja is a more general interpretation of the word timidity. And so that is a fear of people's opinion, a fear of what people will say, fear of people in general, fear of social opprobrium, fear of, like he says here, that one shouldn't be ashamed to dance in ecstasy in the name of God. Sri Ramakrishna would tease those disciples, the young boy disciples and householder disciples like him, if they were afraid to sing and dance in the name of God in Dakshineshwar. He would often tease him, the recorder of the gospel, calling him an old man. He acts like an old man because he wouldn't sing in front of others. He wouldn't get up and dance in front of others, and so forth. He had that shyness. So Sri Ramakrishna tried to tease it out of him. Once in Dakshineshwar, first I have to explain that the Ganges is a tidal river near the coast. That is, it's affected by the tides of the ocean. At high tide, the water comes back up the Ganges. The direction of the current reverses. And when there's low tide, the water flows back into the ocean. So that happens even in Calcutta and even Dakshineshwar, which is even further north than Calcutta from the ocean, which is to the south there. The Hooghly, that branch of the Ganges, goes south into the Bay of Bengal, passing Calcutta, and Dakshineshwar is just north of Calcutta. So even there in Dakshineshwar, 60 miles, more than 60 miles from the ocean, still the tidal effect is there. And so now you don't see it as much. It's there, but you don't see it much as we used to see it, even in my time, or early time in India, in the 70s. Because of various dams that have been put across the Ganges to provide water and electric current. But before the Ganges was dammed at a number of places, the Ban, as it was called in Bengali, the wave from the ocean at high tide, there would be a wave of water coming back up the Ganges. And to make a huge commotion, you see this big wall of water coming. It was quite a sight. So whenever there was a big bond predicted by the phase of the moon and the season of the year and so forth, everybody would know that at such and such a time the bond is supposed to come, and so people would run to the bank of the Ganges to see it. But in Sri Ramakrishna's time, they didn't have the posted timings for the change of tide and all of that. And so it would come as a surprise somewhat when it actually came. So one day, Sri Ramakrishna, I can't remember, must have been early in the morning or at night or maybe during the noon rest hour after lunch. But it was sometime when the young boys were either asleep or resting. And Sri Ramakrishna, who never rested, even in sleep, his mind was wide awake. He heard the bond coming, and so he told the other the boys who were staying with him, his young disciples, to get up and run to the bank of the Ganges to see the bond. By the time the bond had come and gone, the boys were just then coming out. And Sri Ramakrishna said, "What happened? Why didn't you come when I called you?" And they said, "Oh, we were putting on our wearing cloths." That is, when they were sleeping, they had taken off their dhotis. And so before running out to see the bond, they were putting on their waiting cloths. And Sri Ramakrishna laughed and said, if you wait to do things like that, then how are you going to see the bond? You just have to come. as you are. And so that idea, he was teasing them out of their lajja, that is the sense of timidity, to come to see the Bon. So in various ways, Sri Ramakrishna would emphasize this, that when there is timidity, when there is hatred, grina, that means a sense of disgust also is included with the grina, that the sense of disgust at things, timidity, disgust, and fear. Tin takte noi. When we have those three, then we don't have the possibility of rising higher in the realm of devotion. So he would say we have to get rid of those. So here he's telling Bijoy because he sees that he's ready to go there. Man is free when he is liberated from this timidity, disgust, and fear. So why disgust? Because disgust comes with a sense of superiority and with a sense of a sense of what is acceptable and not acceptable. And so that some of that is important in the early stages of spiritual life, because along with that comes a heightened sense of morality, things that are acceptable, things that are not acceptable, things I should do, things I should not do. These are things which are given up in higher spiritual life when one has a spontaneous sense of morality, which is not based on disgust. Then morality comes because it has become one's nature. One doesn't do the right thing and not do the wrong thing, not because of disgust or fear or timidity, but because what else will I do? That's the only thing to do is the moral thing. The very idea of doing something immoral doesn't come to the mind. So these things are for higher spiritual life. But as we try to grow in devotion, that we begin to have to practice these things. So we'll stop here and continue from this point to next time. And so let me give announcements, and then I will take any questions if there are some. So for announcements, on Sunday, we have question and answers. So I depend on you to provide a talk. So you can leave a question by email at info@houstonvedanta.org, or those of you who have my personal email can send it to my personal email. You can get our center's email, which comes to me also, from the website if you don't know it, and don't have mine also. Or you can call and leave a message and leave a question, however you like to do it. But Sunday will depend on your questions. Then next Tuesday, we'll continue the Katha Upanishad class at 7:30 as usual, live streamed. Next Thursday, we will not have this class. We won't continue this class until the week after next, because next Thursday we have our annual Kali Puja. It's the actual day of Kali Puja, or the night of Kali Puja. And so it will be here in this temple at 6:30 at night, 6:30 until 8:30, the worship of Mother Kali, the special annual worship of Mother Kali, a very special night. And the in-person seating is already all reserved. We had 25 seats open for people, plus the volunteers. And so all of the seats were reserved within a day of posting the announcement. So I'm sorry there are no more in-person seats, but all can watch it on YouTube as you're watching this class. It will be live streamed in real time, so you can watch there. So 6:30 till 8:30. And then at 8:30, when the worship is over, those who are not here in person, but wish to come to offer a flower to Mother Kali and to receive prasad, you can come at 8:30, and one family at a time will be allowed to, or a single person, either way as you come, to come in and to pay their respects to the image, to offer a flower, and to receive blessed food, prasad, a box of blessed food. There won't be a full meal of prasad with sitting and everything, but you will be given a box of prasad to take with you. So we encourage people to come for that. So those are the announcements. And before I give the closing chant, there's a question here. Unselfish work, is this the yajna described in Gita chapter 4? Yes, that is what Sri Krishna is speaking about. When Sri Krishna says, chapter 4 especially talks about it expands the idea of yajna, the idea of sacrifice, where everything is seen as sacrifice. So yajna, the Sanskrit word, which again is translated as sacrifice, that was a concept in Vedic times, which is very much present in the Upanishads, present in the Gita, and it continued in a transformed sense through the Hindu tradition. But in the Gita, Sri Krishna expands the concept of sacrifice to include all kinds of actions, like breathing in and breathing out through pranayama, control of the breath. That also is a sacrifice. He says that some they're eating they take as a sacrifice. Work is a sacrifice. Every action can be seen as a sacrifice. So he universalizes the concept of sacrifice. And so, yes, that is speaking of unselfish work. That is, I'm not doing this work because I want this thing and I want to get it out of this thing. That is, with a selfish motivation. I'm working because it is my worship. It is my sacrifice. Sri Krishna says, even breathing, offering the in-breath into the out-breath and offering the out-breath into the in-breath. Everything in life is of the nature of sacrifice. And so if we are filled with the spirit of sacrifice and the glory and the beauty of sacrifice, every action becomes a sacrifice, then it's no longer, I want this thing and so I'm doing it for myself, to get it for myself. But no, I'm doing it because it's there to be done. And I have an opportunity to do it. And so I do it freely as my sacrifice, as my worship. So yes. So just last thing on that, let me say for now that that is a way of seeing unselfish work. That's the way that is taught in the chapter 4 of the Gita by Sri Krishna. So, yes. Yeah, so Surin is saying that most of the yajnas in the Vedic times were done to get something, and that's true. Yajnas were taught by doing a yajna, you could get heavenly life. By doing a yajna, you could get children. By doing a yajna, your children could be more virtuous. By doing a yajna, you could get great wealth. By doing a yajna, you could gain a dominion, kingship, and so forth. So yajnas were taught in the Vedas with desired results in mind. You do it because you want to get this thing. And so what Sri Krishna does in the Gita is that he says that the whole universe is a yajna and everything within it is a yajna, but there he sees yajna in its cosmic significance, not as I'm going to get something by giving this. So he sees sacrifice in the Gita as a way of that everything in life gives way to something else. That birth gives way to life, life gives way to death. Youth gives way to, or childhood gives way to youth, youth gives way to adulthood, adulthood gives way to old age. The universe itself comes out of the sacrifice of the cosmic being. The unity of the cosmic being is sacrificed into multiplicity. And that multiplicity is eventually sacrificed back into the unity of the being. So there in the Gita, Sri Krishna universalizes the idea of sacrifice, that it's not, I give this in order to get that thing that I want. No, to see that everything is giving up its own nature. The fall gives way to the winter, winter gives way to spring, spring gives way to summer. The low tide gives way to the high tide gives way to the low tide. And again, life gives way to death, and death gives way to new life. So when you see that sacrifice is in the very nature of the universe, that one thing gives its being for the arising of something else, then you lose attachment to everything and you do all work just as sacrifice. It's there to be done I do it as a participation in the cosmic sacrifice of God. No longer that I want to get this thing by doing that action. No, it's just action for the sake of action. Karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. Yours is the right to action, not to the fruits of action. So, with that, I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampadhritavigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.